Hello and welcome back. Today I want to talk about the allegory of the olive tree in Jacob 5 in the Book of Mormon, but we won't be discussing the allegory itself. Instead, I want to discuss the significance that this allegory had for Lehi and his family. As modern readers, we usually see it as a semi-interesting symbolic discussion of the scattering and gathering of Israel. But for Lehi's family, it may have been much more meaningful, and we'll return to that topic in a minute. When we think of Lehi's family, we think of Nephi as stalwart and faithful, and Laman and Lemuel as resistant, and Sam as kind of along for the ride. But we usually don't think much about Lehi, and when we do, he's typically presented as a tired, eccentric, white-haired old man who had a vision that he needed to take his family to a promised land. But Lehi wasn't very old. People typically married in their teens back then, and Lehi's oldest son wasn't married yet. He and Sariah could have been in their 30s or early 40s. Sariah, Lehi's wife, gave birth to 2 more sons after they left Jerusalem. Lehi was also wealthy and educated. He was able to read and write in Egyptian. He had property and treasure, and as we find out, he knows how to look after a group while in the wilderness. And because of this, some people think that he may have been a traveling merchant. But in the first year of King Zedekiah, prophets came to Jerusalem saying that people must repent or be destroyed. Lehi was not one of those prophets, but he heard their warning, and 1 Nephi 1:5 tells us that he prayed with all his heart on behalf of his people. And when he did, he saw a vision in which an angel gave him a book to read. Again, Lehi was an educated guy who could read. In this book, he read that Jerusalem would be destroyed and its citizens carried away captive. He also read about a future Messiah and also the redemption of the world. So Lehi went into Jerusalem and began to tell the people what he had learned. But they wanted none of it. It says that they mocked him and sought to take away his life. I think I've mentioned this before, but the way it's phrased, it doesn't seem that the crowd started throwing rocks while he was standing there preaching. Instead, he may not have known that his life was in jeopardy until God warned him in a dream. And it wasn't the sort of thing where he could apologize and wait for things to cool off. It seems more like Lehi had a death sentence and would be killed if he ever returned to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was living under the law of Moses, and it seems most likely that the religious leadership considered his teachings about the future Messiah and the redemption of the world to be blasphemous. And the sentence for blasphemy was death by stoning. The religious leaders probably decided on his sentence behind closed doors and would have carried it out, but God warned Lehi in a dream. He left everything behind and fled with his family into the wilderness. But it's not like the Jews hated his whole family. His sons returned to Jerusalem twice, but Lehi had to stay away. We can only imagine how Lehi must have felt. God had commanded him to deliver a message to the people. He had done so, and now he had lost everything. Probably a rather confusing and unexpected situation. We're never told exactly when Lehi found out that God intended to lead his family to a promised land. Nephi learned about it in 1 Nephi chapter 2, verse 20. Lehi doesn't mention it, though, until chapter 5, after Nephi and his brothers have returned with the plates from Laban. But it's probably safe to assume that Lehi knew about God's plan to lead them to a promised land at least as early as Nephi did. And honestly, since Lehi knew that Jerusalem would be destroyed, stealing the brass plates from the treasury may have been as much about saving the plates themselves as it was about making sure that Lehi's family had the scriptures and remained literate. Because when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem a few years later, they pillaged everything and destroyed the temple and the whole city, and the brass plates would not have survived. But about those plates. Not only did those plates contain the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, but also a record of the Jews from the beginning down to the present day, meaning down to the first year of the reign of King Zedekiah. The plates were a current record. They were continuously being updated on both the political and religious goings-on in Jerusalem, and they were guarded in a treasury. So the plates that Nephi stole from Laban may very well have been Jerusalem's official record. But that's not what today's video is about. We cover all of that in the video about 1 Nephi 3 if you want to check that out. Today we're talking about why the olive tree allegory would have been important to Lehi's family. In 1 Nephi 5, shortly after Nephi and his brothers returned to the wilderness, Lehi, it says, took the records which were engraven upon the plates of brass, and he did search them from the beginning. Given that Lehi was a landowner, and that he and his family had lands for their inheritance, it's almost certain that he had a vineyard, because that's what people living near Jerusalem did with their land. And by the way, a typical vineyard included both grapes and olive trees, where the olive trees served as a sort of trellis for the grapevines. So Lehi and possibly his whole family would have been intimately familiar with caring for olive trees. And if you're curious, that's also why the olive tree allegory takes place in a vineyard. At the time, if you had a sick tree, it was fairly common practice to remove some branches from the main tree and graft them to a wild rootstock, and to bring wild branches in and attach them to the original tree. A successful graft could improve disease resistance, result in better olives, and increase other favorable attributes. Lehi was probably trying to make sense of the situation that he and his family were in. And when he searched the brass plates and read Zenos, comparing the house of Israel to a decaying olive tree, he may have had a light bulb moment where everything finally made sense. In that allegory, an olive tree is starting to decay. So the servant working in the vineyard is told to take branches from the tree and graft them into other trees elsewhere in the vineyard. We see Lehi excitedly sharing this perspective with his family in 1 Nephi 10. Yea, even my father spake much concerning the Gentiles, and also concerning the house of Israel, that they should be compared like unto an olive tree, whose branches should be broken off and should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. Wherefore, he said, it must needs be that we should be led with one accord into the land of promise, unto the fulfilling of the word of the Lord, that we should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. And after the house of Israel should be scattered, they should be gathered together again. Or in fine, after the Gentiles had received the fullness of the gospel, the natural branches of the olive tree, or the remnants of the house of Israel, should be grafted in or come to the knowledge of the true Messiah, their Lord and their Redeemer. This allegory clearly resonated with Lehi. It also made sense to Nephi, but his brothers either didn't understand it or didn't want to understand it. You may have noticed that when someone is mad, they're not typically in the right frame of mind to make symbolic connections. And Laman and Lemuel were really pretty angry about leaving home. In 1 Nephi 15, Nephi found his brothers arguing with each other. Nephi asked what the argument was about, and they told him that they didn't understand what their dad meant when he talked about the olive tree. So Nephi tried to help them out. Behold, I say unto you that the house of Israel was compared unto an olive tree by the Spirit of the Lord which was in our father. And behold, are we not broken off from the house of Israel? And are we not a branch of the house of Israel? And now the thing which our father meaneth concerning the grafting of the natural branches, and he goes on to explain to his brothers that their family, Lehi's family, is being taken to another part of the vineyard and grafted in there. And at some point in the future, their descendants would be brought back and would rejoin the house of Israel. The olive tree story made sense to Nephi. At this point, he had just seen the history of the world in a vision, and to him the symbolism was as plain as day. I will point out that in the allegory, it's interesting that Lehi's branch was not planted in the ground and expected to grow from a tiny cutting, but instead it was grafted into a wild tree. To me, that implies that, as I've covered in other videos, the Americas were probably not vacant when Lehi's family arrived. Instead, they were grafted in, which to me means they joined the people or the cultures that were already there. But that's what I wanted to cover today. I hadn't really appreciated how important the allegory of the tree might have been to Lehi and his family in understanding why God was transplanting them to the far side of the world. But they were from Jerusalem and understood how to care for olive trees and vineyards. So when God explained their scattering in those terms, it all made sense to them. So the olive tree allegory may have been more for their benefit than for ours, which makes sense because it was written in the small plates, which Nephi says that he wrote for his descendants. Mormon's record was written for us, but Nephi's small plates were written for his people. That's what he says. But I'm starting to introduce new topics and I need to wrap up. Let me know what you think. Does this make sense? Is it helpful? Let me know in the comments and subscribe if you haven't. And I will see you next time.